When the Nikon Zf came out, I was rather intrigued, to say the least. So I reached out to Nikon South Africa, who very kindly loaned me a Nikon Zf along with 28 to 75mm 2.8 lens and an FTZ adapter for me to take along on a workshop that I was leading with Nature's Light to Madagascar. So for the last 2 and a bit weeks, I've been playing solely with the Zf as my principal camera while traveling through Madagascar. Now, the reason why I wanted to look at this as a travel camera is that during the workshop, you are not just shooting street photography, something that the Zf has already been acclaimed for by various YouTubers out there. Rather, when you're doing travel photography, you're shooting street, you're doing landscape, you're doing astro, you're doing animals, you're doing people, and you're doing basic still life photography. Essentially, you're an eclectic photographer capturing everything around you. What you need is a camera that can handle all of those situations, not just a street camera. And this is one of the misconceptions that people have when they approach the Nikon Zf. Everyone's talking about it as being an awesome street camera, but can it be a fantastic travel photography camera? I'm not saying that there is such a thing as the perfect travel camera, because a good case could be made for carrying something like, for instance, a Sony RX100. It's pocketable, it's got a decent lens, it's got a largish image sensor size at 1 inch. So in theory, maybe that's a better travel camera. But what I'm looking for is a camera that can handle a multitude of situations, has a state-of-the-art full-frame sensor, because that's my personal choice in how I want to use a camera, and also does pretty good video at the end of the day as well. So this video is not going to be a blow-by-blow account on the specifications of the camera itself. Rather, it's going to be my account of how I found it to be useful as a travel camera while I was traveling through Madagascar. If you want to see a full range of specs, there are a huge number of websites as well as YouTubers out there who have gone through them blow by blow. To me, what's important is how it worked for my usage in the field, and perhaps you'll find that useful as well. Now, there's a lot of stuff on the internet at the moment talking about how this camera is the ultimate street camera. And one of the problems that we have is that we tend to conflate street photography with travel photography. Is it the perfect travel camera? A lot of people seem to like it for street photography, partly because the whole design kind of creates this ethos reminiscent of Henri Cartier-Bresson or Pierre Roman or Bill Brandt or any of the other big street name photographers from the 70s and 80s, etc., etc. Okay, so let's start with the build quality. This thing feels like a brick. It feels again like my old Nikon F3. It's really robust. It's kind of hefty in the hand, it's actually slightly heavier than the Nikon Z7 and Z6. But it feels comfortably heavy in the hand. It doesn't feel like the ZF-C, which is really lightweight and almost plasticky when you handle it. Similarly, some of the Fujifilm cameras that I've handled in the past, and I actually own a Fujifilm X series camera as well, they don't feel quite as robust as the Nikon. The Nikon Zf is marketed as being weather sealed, dust and drip proof. What that means, I'm not sure. They haven't actually published any kind of IP results or anything like that, but certainly from other users, you can assume that the camera is going to handle working in inclement weather fairly comfortably. The whole body is a magnesium alloy, so again, it's pretty tough, and I have to admit that it came back from Madagascar unscathed, and I tend to abuse my equipment. The aesthetics of the camera. Does this affect the way that people shoot, and as well the way that people respond to the camera when it's pushed into their faces? Now, if you approach somebody with a great big socking D850, it's a big physical camera. It's a big thing that you're pushing into somebody's face, and yes, it's intimidating. The Z6 and the Z7 are surprisingly actually ever so slightly smaller than the ZF, but they still look more imposing. The ZF, on the other hand, doesn't look imposing. It looks kind of cool for somebody who knows what a camera is, and very often when I did pick it up, people would ask, are you shooting film? The impression that it gives people is going to also affect the way that they approach the camera when they're being photographed. So in my experience now over the last 2 weeks, I would say that as a people camera, shooting people on the street, shooting people during travel, the ZF was, for want of better words, a better camera than something like the Z9 or the Z8, which are big. This again brings back my point that the camera is designed to be able to use small pancake lenses. I personally think that shooting with prime lenses is a great way to shoot, and I'm opposed to the whole concept of using super zooms and big zooms as travel lenses. But that's my style of shooting. You might find that you vary and you prefer having something like their new 28 to 400mm lens, which I must say is an extremely impressive lens. One of the photographers on the workshop had one, and it was amazing being able to go from landscape through to shooting lemurs and getting full facial portraits of the little critters while we're out there. But it's a big lens, and it's imposing when you approach somebody with a lens like that. The other thing about a lens that big and heavy is that it doesn't really suit the Nikon Zf, particularly without the grip on the side. Anytime I was using a big lens, I really did miss having that big deep grip that was originally included on cameras like the Nikon F4. There's a reason why those grips are so popular. Getting rid of it is a risk, you could probably say. However, it doesn't mean you can't have the grip, you just need to add the grip. Although admittedly that does add weight to your camera, although not that much. And besides, if you're going to use an L bracket, well, you're going to put it on anyway. If there's something that I found slightly irritating was the lack of accessories that are out there. I shoot with an L bracket all the time, and trying to find one for the ZF was difficult. In the end, I had to purchase a three-legged thing Ellie, which I had to modify so that it actually fitted properly by drilling another hole and opening up the gap on the L bracket so that the tilty screen would actually work on the Nikon Zf. On that note, the Nikon Zf has a very different kind of LCD screen to the rest of Nikon's lines in that it has a tilty screen which goes all the way around so that you can do selfies if you want to. Not that that's necessarily the purpose behind it, but it does mean that the accessories are going to be slightly different when you're working with the camera itself. What's nice is the ports are not obstructed when you do fold it out, although you will find that your USB-C port might potentially be affected if you were to tilt the screen itself. So at least the HDMI out and the mic port are unobstructed by the swivel out screen itself. In terms of L brackets, I would probably think that the Leofoto LPN ZF is the best one out there at the moment because it's the only grip that I could find that actually has a L bracket alternative. There's a little Arca Swiss style block that comes out the bottom and doesn't obstruct the tilty screen in any way. The downside to that particular bracket is you're not going to be able to center the optical center of the lens when you have it on its side shooting vertically because the bracket is off to the bottom of the camera base itself. I suspect that if the ZF is any more popular, there will be more L brackets coming out, but we'll have to see. You're going to find that people who look at the camera or use the camera fall into two camps. Those that absolutely love the dials approach that's been added by Nikon going retro, so to speak, and those that eschew that and would rather just have the command wheel and button press to be able to access the controls on their camera. Now, a lot was made out of the ZF when it originally came out that it was basically like a digital Nikon FM. I actually disagree with that concept. I've been shooting with Nikon FEs since the late 1990s, and that is a small svelte camera. And although the marketing says that the Nikon ZF is small, it's not. If you compare it to something like the Z6 Mark II and the Z7 Mark II, that's actually 5 grams heavier, including the battery, and is ever so slightly larger on the width as well as on the height of the camera itself. So don't think that when you buy a Nikon ZF, you're getting a small street camera. If anything, I'd say that the camera is more reminiscent of the Nikon F3 as opposed to the Nikon FM or the FE series of cameras. The F3 has a similar girth and weight and also the similar kind of shape and size. I own an F3 and I shoot with one relatively regularly, and I found that the shooting experience as well was very similar from the F3 to the ZF than compared to, say, the FE to the ZF. So if you are used to shooting with an old film camera like the F3, particularly of that particular size, you'll find that the transition to the ZF is seamless. You can continue shooting the ZF as if you were shooting a film camera, if that's the way that you want to shoot. You need to realize that when you buy the Nikon ZF, you are buying into the whole concept of a retro camera, which means that you are going for the dial approach. You want to have the lack of grip, which Could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your particular take on how a camera should operate. Okay, let's just briefly talk about the lens itself. The 28-75 was really nice and sharp. The 2.8 is fantastic for photographing in low light. The lens itself is relatively lightweight, but, and this is a great big but, as a camera, as a lens that is fitted to the ZF, it's actually just too big. I personally think that the 24-70 f4 is a better fit if you're going to buy the ZF. It's smaller, it's lighter, and it's more compact. The whole thing about the ZF is it's easier to handle when you're using a compact lens on it. As a travel camera setup, I would say go for the smaller lens set. Me personally, if I were to buy the ZF, I would pair it with a bunch of small primes, which are going to be fast, easy to use, and small and light, and less obtrusive. Again, if you're going to be photographing somebody, pushing a great big 24-70 f2.8 lens into their face is intimidating. If you want to get great photographs of strangers and you've gotten the permission to photograph them, don't approach them with something that looks like a weapon. Using a small lens on a camera like the ZF is a fantastic way to be able to get into their personal space and photograph them so that they do not feel intimidated, so that they are open to the camera itself. And I suspect that's one of the reasons why a lot of pundits have said that the Nikon ZF is such a good street photographer's camera, because they're putting small lenses on it. They're not putting great galumphing monstrous lenses that intimidate the life out of the person when you poke it into their faces. With all of that out of the way, the 28-75 was a great lens. Really, really nice and sharp. I just don't think it's particularly well suited to the ZF, in my personal opinion. Go for the 24-70 if you can, or smaller primes if you're going to go the whole sort of zeitgeist around the ZF and go for the smaller travel photography kind of setup. I'm fairly sure that in the commentary below this video, I'm going to get a couple of people saying, oh, just get yourself a super zoom, get a 24-300 or whatever, any of those something to everything lenses. I seriously dislike those lenses for one particular reason if you are traveling, and that is, if it breaks, you're stuffed. And I've had this with photographers coming on workshops before. They've bought an all-in-one zoom that does everything, and something's happened to it. And then they're left with a body without a lens. It's far safer as a travel photographer to have a series of smaller zooms or prime lenses, so that if something happens to one lens, you can still continue shooting. So my personal approach is not to use a single lens that is going to cover everything from wide angle through to telephoto. It's far better, and you get an optically better solution if you use shorter zoom length lenses and primes, as opposed to one big do-it-all zoom. The whole camera operates far more simply and easily when you're using a very small lens on it. It's not designed for using big lenses, and every time I stuck one of the larger lenses like my 70-200 f4 on the FTZ adapter, I've very much got the impression that the camera is harder to hold. So if you are going to buy a ZF, I absolutely recommend that you get something like the Leofoto LPN ZF L bracket, or the small rig grip that Nikon even provided with the camera when it first launched. The lack of a grip is going to bother some people, but if you use it in the way that it was designed to be used, which I suspect is with a small lens, then it's not necessarily a problem, and it's actually relatively comfortable to hold. I found that holding it like my old Nikon film cameras was very, very simple. In other words, the little finger goes underneath the bottom of the camera grip, and you can find that you are hand-holding fairly easily as a result of that. What it is missing, which the old film cameras had though, is the film forward release lever. What a lot of photographers would do is they would have that half cocked out so that the thumb fit inside there, and it meant that they could hold the camera far more easily. One of the reasons why the ZF is slightly wider or longer from side to side than the Z7 and the Z6 Mark II is because the battery itself is placed so that it is in a different position. With the Z6, Z8, and the Z7, the battery is positioned such that it falls inside the hand grip. Not having the hand grip means that the battery has to go lengthways now, so that it is in line with the length of the body itself. This is not necessarily a great thing, but it does mean that the Nikon ZF continues to use the EN-EL15 series of batteries. And I found that apart from a generic battery, which was an EN-EL15A variant, they all worked. So I could use the original batteries that I bought with my D800, and they're still working inside the Nikon Zf. So it does mean that there's continuity from DSLR through to the Z system through to the ZF, which makes this a really useful camera if you are deciding to upgrade from, say, DSLR. The one change though is that rather than having a door on the side of the camera where you can access your SD card slot, you have to actually do it through the battery compartment. Not a great decision in my opinion, but I understand why they did it, for keeping the lines of the camera as retro as possible. What it means is that you have to open the battery cover door to be able to access your SD card or the backup micro SD card slot. So it does actually have two card slots, and if you're worried about having backup, you can stick a 128 gigabyte micro SD that can then record your backup files or your JPEGs or whatever to at the same time as having your SD card slot. So that is included, which is quite good. There is also weather sealing on the door itself, which is a good sign and also indicates the weatherproofability or tropicability maybe of the camera itself. Also useful is knowing that you can charge your batteries as well as run the camera off of the USB-C slot. So if you are shooting this video, you can actually connect a power bank to the camera, and it does mean that you can continue shooting. You might still have issues with the record limit of 29 minutes, but at least you know that you're going to have juice if you're going to be doing multiple takes on, for instance, a travel scenario, or even if you're using this as an actual camera for video production. In terms of the controls themselves, I also find that they are more similar to some kind of blend between the Nikon F3 and the Nikon F4. This is particularly the case with the mode dial, which is a mode switch on the left-hand side beneath the ISO dial itself. So you'll see it goes from manual, aperture, shutter, program, and auto. Very similar to the old Nikon F4, which had the mode switch on the right-hand side underneath the shutter release button. Even the indentations on the switches harken back to the F4 as opposed to the F3 or earlier to the FM and the FE. I personally found that I was able to transition across to a dial approach very, very easily, and I didn't have to take my eyes from the viewfinder when I was shooting. Once more, this is partly because I have experience shooting film cameras. I can use my index finger to be able to control the shutter speed dial while looking through the lens. I don't have to take my eyes away from the viewfinder itself. If there's a downside to the design that Nikon have used, it's the fact that the old film cameras revolved around using an aperture ring, not a control wheel on the camera itself. So I found that it was a little bit complicated trying to adjust my aperture and the shutter speed, to the point that I ended up having to put the aperture onto the thumb control dial at the back. Ideally, if you want to use the ZF the way it was probably intended to be used, you need to think about buying one of the new Chinese manufactured lenses which have an aperture ring inside them and are all manual. The ISO dial is contentious as well, because some photographers like having a push button and command wheel approach to being able to change their ISO. Again, I'm not that way inclined. I tend to prefer setting my ISO manually and not leaving it in auto ISO. So I actually took quite quickly to using the ISO dial itself. And again, if you know how to use the dial, it's very easy to change it even with your eye to the viewfinder itself. Nikon have left obviously a setting as well that you can just turn it to C, and then it means that you've either just use your finger wheel command dial approach, or it can go into auto ISO really, really simply. So they've left options to the photographers out there. If you want a camera that can do the push button and command wheel approach, you can have a camera that does that. If you want to use the camera as a all manual mode camera with the dials, you can also do it that way. You can have both options available in one camera, which is actually pretty cool, I think. The one button I didn't use, and I know some photographers have really liked it, and there was even one review that I read which said this was a game changer and they loved it, and that's the black and white toggle, which quite frankly I thought was a waste of space. Underneath the shutter speed dial, you've got a toggle that goes between black and white, stills, and video. The stills video switch, that's fantastic, but I never used the black and white. I shoot raw all the time anyway, and I don't need to see the image in black and white to be able to pre-visualize the image that I would be shooting as if it were in black and white. So for me, it was a non-entity, I didn't really see any point. I would have far preferred having either a custom setting or some other kind of option there. And in fact, I still think that personally, if I were designing the camera, I would have put the AMSP dial somewhere underneath the shutter dial, a la the f4, as opposed to sticking it on the left-hand side of the camera away from where your thumb would be. But that's my personal choice. In terms of the exposure compensation dial, I thought it was really nicely placed. I quite like the fact that my thumb can hit it very easily and turn the dial so that I can go to underexposure or overexposure. So that was also really, really good. It doesn't have the big Nintendo dial that you're going to see inside the Z8 and the Z9. It's just got the sort of Coolpix style thumb toggle at the back, which gives you your four-way direction pad around an OK button. So there's actually a relative dearth of direct controls, which is maybe a good thing considering the ethos that Nikon were approaching with the Nikon Zf. I personally didn't mind the lack of controls. Everything is really quickly obtainable by just hitting the I button and then getting into your quick menu. The dial runs in one-stop increments from 4 seconds to 1/8,000th of a second, and also includes bulb time, a shutter sync of 1/200th of a second, and a 1/3 setting, which pushes shutter control to the command wheel and opens up shutter speeds of up to 900 seconds. The ZF has a decent sync speed of 1/200,000th of a second, so pretty standard when it comes around to the older focal plane shutters. Not necessarily outstanding if you consider the fact that something like the Nikon D850 can shoot at 320th of a second sync speed. Still more than good enough for any kind of professional flash use if you know what you're doing with flashes. Although not necessarily the best viewfinder out there, I found that it was perfectly usable and close enough to the optical viewfinder experience that I was able to transition into shooting with an EVF very, very seamlessly. Like a lot of other photographers who've jumped from DSLR through to mirrorless cameras, the ability to see your exposure live is mind-blowing. This is particularly useful when you are shooting street scenes and you've got changing light conditions all the time, and by looking through the viewfinder you know that you've nailed it before you've even pressed the button. On the point of all manual, I found that one of my favorite lenses, which is a Voigtlander 40mm f2 lens, suddenly just shone on the ZF. With this on the FTZ adapter, I was able to really, really quickly focus thanks to the incredibly accurate peaking that you could see inside your viewfinder. Switch peaking on, and like with video cameras, you can then see where objects are in focus or out of focus. The peaking is even affected by the depth of field that you've chosen. So as a manual focus camera, the ZF was fantastic and absolutely a joy to use, to the point that I probably got more manual focus keepers while doing street photography than I've been able to get in for years, basically. Autofocus was exceptional. I'm used to using DSLRs, obviously, and although I've shot with the Z6, Z7, and Z8, this was one of the best experiences I've had with mirrorless autofocus. The autofocus system is apparently the same as that inside the Z8 and the Z9, although I'm fairly sure that the Z6, when it comes out next week apparently, is going to probably be better or at least akin to the Z8 and now the ZF. Shooting next to another photographer on the workshop who had a Z7, the ZF very definitely has a better autofocus system compared to it. It has full range of choices between animal and face detection. It has the old 3D like the old DSLR cameras. It's got wide range autofocus. It's a really, really competent autofocus system, and one which should be fairly easy to get to grips with if you're shooting with it. One of the things that a lot of people thought might potentially be useful, and which I actually ended up just not using, was the high megapixel mode. The ZF has the option to be able to use its sensor and pixel shift to be able to create up to 96 megapixel images by using 8, 16, or 32 files every time it shoots. The problem with this process, though, is one, you have to have NX Studio to be able to merge the photographs. So if you're using Lightroom or Capture One, sorry, tough, you can't use those images necessarily. Then there's the problem that everything has to be rock solidly placed on a tripod. There's no such thing as a handheld pixel shift shot. On top of that, at the end, if there's any movement inside your photograph, it's going to come out with some kind of weird ghosting effect that you're going to get inside the photographs. So for me, I felt like the pixel shift was really just a tick box item that Nikon could say that they have added to the camera itself. And although I tried it a few times, the fact that I would have 32 images, which also greatly increases your storage space, and the complication of processing them later meant that after a couple of days I just gave up with pixel shift and I started shooting just with the 24 megapixel sensor on its own. If you do shoot in perfect conditions though, the results are extremely impressive and there is a marked resolution jump and added detail to the images. I mean, this is a state-of-the-art 24 megapixel BSI sensor, so you don't need to worry about the image quality. 24 megapixels is oodles of information. Yes, it's not 45 megapixels, and every now and again I would miss the detail of my D850. You can easily print images of 17 inches across without any interpolation to be able to use that 24 megapixel sensor. And lest we not forget that less than 15 years ago, 24 megapixels was awesome! You didn't need to have more than 12 at that stage. So 24 megapixels is absolutely fine. One of the things that blew me away was the see-in-the-dark abilities of the camera. The ISO from 100 to 400 is basically noiseless. You don't see any grain whatsoever. At 800, maybe a tiny bit of grain, but it's still really, really usable. So if you're shooting things like we were lemurs or people on streets, 800 ISO is absolutely fine. I had no qualms with using it. 1600 also still extremely clean. And then there was the ability at high ISO photographing the night sky. 3200, although it has grain, is very low grain compared to some of the other cameras I've used. But more than anything, the ability to focus on stars with the EVF on was amazing. It was a game changer in some ways. I'm used to squinting at the live view on the back of a DSLR or through the EVF or the live view of something like the Nikon Z6 or Z7 to be able to maybe make out a star in the distance to be able to focus and get my infinity correctly focused. The ZF was absolutely mind-blowingly good at this. You could see the stars even at 1600 ISO with the 2.8 lens that I was using, a 14 to 24 millimeter, the old DSLR lens, which performed superbly on the ZF with the FTZ adapter. If you happen to be a photographer who's transitioning from DSLR through to mirrorless and you decide to use something like the ZF, go for the newer version of the FTZ adapter or one of the off-brand units, I guess. I have to admit that I had no qualms necessarily using the F-mount lenses that I have, and they all performed really, really well, including the manual focus lenses. And on top of that, you've got sensor shift vibration reduction, which is mind-blowingly good. I couldn't believe the fact that I now had vibration reduction on my Voigtlander as well as an old 24mm AIS lens. And then on top of that, the ability to have that vibration reduction on the sensor when you are filming is phenomenal. Another really cool thing that I found about the ZF is something that I haven't had since I had my Nikon D3 years ago, and that was voice recorder. What's really awesome is after I've taken a photograph, I can hit the play button, go into the I button, and then record a voice recording about the image itself. So if I'm photographing somebody, I can then ask them their name or any details, and then we can record that onto the metadata of the file as you're going. This is fantastic. If you're a journalist or a travel writer or a travel photographer, it means you can take a photograph and then add metadata verbally to your camera immediately. Yes, you've got this on things like the Z8 and the Z9, but you don't have it on the Z6 Mark II or the Z7 Mark II. So it's a really, really great way to be able to add information to your photograph after you've taken the photo. Here's something else that the ZF absolutely excels at, and which was an interesting case in point when it came out after the Z6 Mark II, which, as we know, is about to be updated. They are the same price to all intents and purposes. They're around $2,000 each. When comparing the Z6 Mark II to the ZF is actually the better video camera. It has full 10-bit N-log recording, so not RAW, but 10-bit N-log recording to the camera itself. So you now get an enormous amount of detail that you can grade in post-production. If I was shooting video, the ZF would actually be the obvious choice over the Z6 Mark II. This is all going to change, obviously, because the Z6 Mark III is going to come out very, very shortly, and I strongly suspect that the acquisition of Red had something to do with its delay, and we're probably going to see a powerhouse video camera coming out of that. However, the Z6 Mark III, I could put money on it, is probably going to be more expensive than the ZF. So the ZF is still going to be a really attractive proposition for video shooters. Now here's something else about that dial approach. I really enjoyed having a dial at the top of the camera as opposed to the push button and the control wheels for when I was shooting video, because I could more easily lock in an exposure than when I was using the wheel and the command wheel and finger toggle approach. If there's something that's lacking, it is a 1/48th second shutter speed, because that would give us 180-degree shutter angle if you're shooting 24p. So therein the ZF does lack. You can put it down to 1/50th of a second, but you're actually not exactly at 180-degree shutter angle. So for video shooters, there is that one little niggle when they're shooting that. Okay, so after 2 and a bit weeks shooting with this camera as my primary camera, I'm going to be a bit sad to send it back to Nikon, I have to admit. I've really enjoyed shooting with it. I was blown away by the raw quality shooting video. I really enjoyed shooting with it on street and people photography. The responsiveness of the camera was fantastic. I loved the weight, I loved the feel. As a video camera, it blew me away. The AFF focus is mind-bogglingly good. The vibration reduction is linked to the actual focus point as well. I was videoing things like chameleons and lemurs with a 70 to 200mm lens, and the stability that I got out of it, I didn't know I could handhold like that. In the past, I've had to either use a gimbal or a tripod to be able to shoot that kind of video. This time around, I was getting away with video shooting that I've never been able to do before. So that was really fantastic, and the focus just locked on. The animal eye recognition that it has was excellent. As a Nikon shooter, going to the ZF and shooting video with it, it was phenomenal. It's a really good camera in that regard. So there's a whole lot more that I could discuss around the camera itself. This hasn't been a full-blown review, so to speak. What it is looking at a specific use case as a travel camera. Can I take it to a location somewhere where you can expect there's going to be some abuse to the camera itself because of the conditions of where you're shooting, and will it be able to perform creating images of all the different subjects that you're likely to do on a travel trip to a country like Madagascar? Can it do night photography? Yes. Can it do people photography? Yes. Can it do street? Yes. Can it do landscape? Yes. Can we do some film work with it? Yes. It's a really versatile camera, to the point that, as of me talking about it right now, if you are not prepared to spend the money on a Z8, this is probably the most versatile Nikon camera out there at the moment. I'm not saying it's better than a Z8 or a Z9. Those are different beasts. They're bigger, they're heavier, and they are significantly more expensive. The ZF at $2,000, although not cheap, is still a really good value for money proposition for a photographer who is needing a camera that can do all of that. It comes down to whether you can handle the retro styling and the dial approach as opposed to the push button and control wheel approach. So yeah, I liked this camera a lot. So I ultimately had a really good shooting experience with the Nikon ZF while in Madagascar. I would highly recommend it as a travel photographer's camera. Although that said, you do need to be aware that it is a different shooting approach when you're shooting with a dial-based retro style camera like the Nikon ZF. I hope you found the video useful. Thanks for watching, and if you've enjoyed it, please remember to pop a like and a subscribe into the bottom corner. With any luck, I'll have some more videos in future with cameras as they come out, particularly if you enjoyed this one. If you have some personal experience with the ZF yourself, pop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear some more about how other people have found the usage of the Nikon ZF. Chances are it's a love-hate relationship based on its retro approach. I liked it. Maybe you didn't. Maybe you did. Anyway, thanks again for watching. Hope to catch you again soon. Cheers.